Simon Cox. I'm the Emerging Markets Editor for the Economist magazine, and I'm joined by Nick Marro, who is an EIU trade analyst and our chief trade warrior. Nick, the EIU has identified a number of risks facing the global economy in 2019. Trade war was number one. Can you tell us how that dispute is likely to unfold this year?
Right. Well, where we are right now is both sides are locked in this incredibly disruptive dispute. Our core forecast for the EIU is that it won't go any further, and that's because President Trump is going to try and get a deal out of that, particularly before the election season. But there is a significant risk to that forecast. There's the potential that the trade war could exacerbate the protectionist tendencies of the U.S. administration, pushing them to impose tariffs on, for example, auto parts. That would be very disruptive for trading partners like the EU. And so the shadow of global trade is going to be cast over the global economy for at least 2019, if not longer.
And we've seen this trade war seem to spill over into what might be described as a tech war. We've heard a lot about 5G, a lot about Huawei. Could you tell us a bit more about that? Do you see the two issues as connected?
Right. I would personally see them as parallel, but definitely linked in some way. A lot of the concerns underlying the trade war are things like forced tech transfer, IP theft, things that are very relevant to the technology industry. We've seen this already start to blend over into the political and security sphere, particularly as the US and its allies are treating Huawei's operations abroad. This is going to, again, be another major risk for the global economy, and it could lead to the further fragmentation of the digital landscape, for example, where we start to see different spheres of influence between Chinese and US-backed ideas or governance of things like the internet. And so this is going to be a major component of the trade war moving forward, and it's going to be something that underpins the strategic rivalry between the US and China into the long term.
So that all sounds very disruptive, very divisive, but are there any potential winners from this trade war?
Right, well, we at the EIU have identified a number of countries, primarily in Southeast Asia, which could benefit as a result of things like investment relocation, investment redeployment, as companies try and shift their supply chains to avoid being hit by the US or Chinese tariffs. Now, those countries aren't going to feel these benefits until the long term, likely 2 to 3 years out at the earliest. But we're looking at Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, countries which already have that type of infrastructure and labor pools to benefit, particularly in areas like low-end manufacturing, auto parts, garments. And so there is this idea that these countries could benefit, but this is going to be a long-term trend, and we're also not expecting to see a mass corporate exodus out of China. It'll be a way as companies pump up their existing supply chain operations, not leaving the Chinese market.
And what about China itself? I mean, some mischievous souls have suggested that China might itself benefit from the kind of demands the Trump administration is making. Do you put any credence to that claim?
Right. I mean, that discussion has been happening for a long time, and really that's a bit of a traditional line that a lot of reform-minded people in China have adopted. This idea that external pressure will force domestic reforms. That's something that we can arguably say happened as part of China's WTO ascension. There is an idea that these reforms could push China in that direction, but there are a number of caveats to that. The first being that any concessions as a result of the trade war might be very difficult for the president, Xi Jinping, to deliver to the domestic audience. And the second being that China's domestic economic policy is towards centralization, the strengthening of the state and state-owned enterprises, not towards allowing the private sector a larger role in the economy. We'll have to figure how that dynamic unfolds before we can even start talking about foreign enterprises.
So it's the little red book against the big red hat. Nick, thanks very much for your time.
My pleasure.